With the Furutakas well underway, at the start of 1924, the twin turrets hoped for were finally completed, so Japan decided to finish off the quartet by starting the two ships of the 8,500-ton Aoba class. From a propulsion, hull design, and protection perspective, they were virtual repeats of the Furutakas. With regard to armament layout, though, they differed due to the twin turrets. Gone was the 6 single enclosed mounts. These were replaced by 3 twin turrets, 2 forward and 1 aft. This left a characteristic gap between turret 2 and the bridge. Also, they adopted the new 120mm 45 caliber dual-purpose anti-aircraft gun from the start rather than the previous 76mm gun. Again, like the Furutakas, even though they were started after it, design work on them was started before the Washington Treaty, so they weren't really treaty cruisers. That is to say, the weight restrictions of the treaty didn't really figure in their design. That came later. Instead, their weight was more about maximizing their speed and minimizing their cost. On the downside, again, they also came out overweight. Originally designed for 7,100 tons, they came out at 8,500 tons, even more overweight than the Furutakas. Again, this meant they had a very low freeboard, were structurally stressed, top-heavy, and could only reach 34 knots rather than their hoped-for 35.5. Following the Tomozuru and Fourth Fleet incidents in the mid-30s, they, along with the Furutakas, were rebuilt to correct these problems and update them to a homogeneous class. All 4 were assigned to the South Seas at the start of the war. This was meant to be rather soft duty, but it got real busy once the Guadalcanal campaign started. Decidedly overaged, they suffered heavily, and only Aoba survived the many battles in the slot. Aoba was started February 4th, 1924, and completed September 20th, 1927. Kinugasa was started January 23, 1924, and completed September 30th, 1927. Main armament was 6 200mm 50 caliber guns in 3 twin turrets, 2 forward and 1 aft. Secondary armament was 4 single open mounts of the new 120mm 45 caliber dual-purpose gun, 1 on each side of the 2 funnels. Entering service in 1926, the 120mm 45 caliber anti-aircraft gun was a modification of an existing low-angle gun, itself derived from a British 4.7-inch gun. By World War II, these guns were being replaced by the 5-inch 40 caliber. Production delays and available yard space, though, meant several ships still carried them. Most in 10 metric ton single open mounts, though notably the carrier Akagi still had them in 20 metric ton twin mounts. Maximum elevation was 75 degrees. Being hand-operated, elevation speed was at most 6.5 degrees per second, and training speed was up to 10 degrees per second. Being hand-worked, loading was theoretically at any angle, but realistically was at about 10 degrees. Rate of fire was realistically about 6 rounds per minute, with a maximum range of 16,000 meters at a maximum ceiling of 10,000 meters at a muzzle velocity of 830 meters per second. Shell weight was 20 kilograms with a 1.9 kilogram bursting charge. Propellant was by a 14.4 kilogram cartridge. Like other large anti-aircraft guns, a fuse could be set to detonate the shell after a set time in flight, and an anti-aircraft shotgun shell was developed. Torpedo armament was again 12 24-inch tubes in 6 pairs, 3 on each side, built into the hull of the ship for the Type 90 torpedo. Aircraft complement was 1 seaplane that could be launched off the 1 catapult. Propulsion was provided by 12 boilers, 2 of which were coal-fired, venting to 3 funnels, the forward 2 of which were trunked together. These provided steam to the 4 turbines that generated 102,000 horsepower. Each turbine ran one of the 4 propellers for a top speed of 34 knots. They used 1 rudder. Armor was a 76mm thick hull plate that protected the machinery spaces and sloped 9 degrees outward from bottom to top. The armored deck topped off the side armor and was 35 millimeters, while the upper deck above it had 47 millimeters. The magazines had 50 millimeter sides. The gun houses had 25 millimeter fronts and 19 millimeter roofs and sides. Modifications between 1938 and 1940 made them virtual sisters to the updated Furutakas. The twin 200 millimeter turrets were removed and replaced with twin 203 millimeter 50 caliber turrets. The 12 hull-mounted torpedo tubes were removed, and 2 quadruple torpedo mounts were added for the Type 93 long lance torpedoes, one mount on each side of the catapult. Like the Furutakas, reloads were carried. The 12 boilers were replaced with 10 oil-burning ones. The 4 turbines were removed and replaced with 4 new ones that generate 110,000 horsepower. The superstructure was rebuilt like the Furutakas, and the conning tower received 36 millimeters of armor. Ballast was added, larger bulges were added to improve their TDS, improve stability, and regain lost buoyancy. Also, the catapult was replaced with a more powerful one, and floatplane complement was increased to 2. Displacement rose to 9,088 tons, and speed dropped to 33 knots. Again, following modernization, they and the previous Furutakas were virtually one class. In February of 1943, while undergoing repairs, Aoba's burned-out Turret 3 was removed and covered over. Also, 4 depth charge rails for 12 depth charges was added. Alas, though, her top speed was still limited to 25 knots due to her damage. In November of 1943, while undergoing repairs, Turret 3 was added again and Type 21 radar was fitted. In July of 1944, Type 22 radar was fitted. Aoba and Kinugasa started the war by covering the invasion of Guam with their twins Furutaka and Kako. In the later half of December 1941, they supported the second invasion of Wake. In late January 1942, they covered the invasion of Rabaul. Then, in early March, the invasion of New Guinea. In late March, they covered the invasion of the Central Solomons. In early May, they covered first the invasion of the Southern Solomons, including Guadalcanal, then the Port Moresby invasion force during the Battle of the Coral Sea. With the invasion of Port Moresby cancelled as a result of the battle, they returned to Japan for refit, which kept them out of the Battle of Midway. Returning to Rabaul in early July, they took part in the overnight Battle of Saville Island. In mid-October, they took part in the Battle of Cape Esperance. There, while Kinugasa was only lightly damaged, Aoba was badly mauled. Her bridge was hit multiple times, mortally wounding the admiral commanding the Japanese force. Her number 1 and number 2 boiler rooms were flooded, cutting her speed in half. Turret 2 was put out of action and Turret 3 was completely burned out. Only the flooding of her aft magazine saved her from a fatal turret explosion. Limping from the battle, she finally arrived in Japan for repairs in late October. Kinugasa, in the meantime, spent the rest of October and early November covering convoys, running troops down the slot, and bombarding the island. In mid-November, she escorted the bombardment force that ran down the slot on the night between the 2 naval battles of Guadalcanal. The next morning, as her force was heading back north for home, it was attacked by Dauntless dive bombers and Avenger torpedo planes. In the attack that lasted from 9:15 a.m. till about 10 a.m., one bomb hit her just in front of the bridge, killing her captain, her first officer, and started a fire. Even worse, another bomb so near missed her stern that it destroyed her rudder and propellers. Finally, 3 torpedoes hit her starboard side and 2 hit her port. Dead in the water and listing, she finally rolled over and sank at about 11:20 a.m. on November 14th. Aoba finally returned to Truk in late February of 1943. Not long afterward, on April 3, 1943, she was in port at New Ireland when the harbor was raided by B-17s using skip bombing and strafing. At least one bomb hit detonated her long-lance torpedoes, causing a fire and massive explosion that cracked her hull so badly that she had to be beached. Sent back to Japan, her repairs would last until late November of 1943, and even then, she could never do better than 25 knots. At the start of 1944, along with most of the fleet, she was sent to the East Indies where she took part in several raids into the Indian Ocean until late October, when she departed to take part in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. During the battle, she was to escort a troop convoy with Kinu and the destroyer Uranami to western Leyte rather than take part in the actual battle. But even before the battle started, at 4:30 a.m. on October 23rd, she was hit starboard midship by a torpedo from the submarine Breen that flooded her rear turbine room and caused her to list to starboard. As a result, she had to be towed to Cavite and underwent emergency repairs until finally able to head back to Japan on November 5th. Finally arriving in mid-December, she was considered not worth repairing and was reclassified as a floating anti-aircraft battery. In late July of 1945, an air attack finally sunk her in port, the stern breaking off and the hull splitting as she settled into the mud.